Just 24 hours after my interview with Federov, he said that Ukraine should have elections. The first major political figure to do that in this country. It was the last person seen with him, the scene of the crime, some might call it. But no, I didn't have anything to do with it. I had no idea that he was going to say what he said, but I did think that there was something slightly off. I was sitting just a few feet away from him. And as soon as I asked about his relationship with Zelensky, what he wanted to do next, that's when he became the most quiet. And that's when I knew that there was something he was holding back. And we realized that when he released his video on Tuesday. And I know how long it takes to edit and produce a video. God forbid, I think I've done enough editing to last a lifetime. But that video was highly produced. It was highly scripted, and it would have taken days to make. And that means that that video was filmed and edited and presented before he sat down with me. And all of this poses a huge amount of questions. It represents a seismic shift right here in Ukraine. You can feel it immediately. Almost everyone has been talking about what's happened in the last couple of days. And because I was one of the last people to speak to Federov publicly, I thought I'd give my take on the whole thing. To understand this, let's look at what happened here with the platforms. Federov was fired, and for a month he didn't give any interviews with any international media, not a single person except for me and CBS News. He did both on the same day. This was recorded on Saturday, and I think that was done on purpose. I think it was a very careful decision, especially now that Federov hasn't just announced that Ukraine should have elections, he's announced himself as a political figure. And if you look at all this through the lens of someone that's trying to position themselves in politics, then it's important to look at the avenues that he chose to do those interviews. The first, CBS News, a news network run by Barry Weiss, who is very close with Elon Musk, who Elon Musk actually chose to release the Twitter files in 2022. That gives me the impression he chose CBS to speak directly to Elon Musk's audience. And then there's my audience. It's primarily the US, the UK, heavily in Ukraine. My interview with Zelensky earlier this year was one of the most watched. So in some ways, a lot of people could look at this and think that he was using this audience to directly speak to Ukrainians here that support Zelensky. But again, back to the reaction. This shocked everyone here in Ukraine. My friends were texting me all night. I woke up in the morning. It was the first thing that people were talking about in coffee shops and bars all across Kyiv. And the Kremlin has come out today and responded to it and said that this means that this city, Kyiv, is no longer homogenous. And what it means by that is that somehow Kyiv is now fractured. And in some ways, that is true, but the only thing that's fractured is the support for Federov. I don't think he was expecting the reaction at all, and that was a complete disillusionment. People here were shocked when he called for an election. And that is because over 57% of Ukrainians completely write off the idea of an election right now during the war. They know exactly what that would mean. And if you don't know what that means, I'll explain it just for a second. There's a reason that Britain had its last election in 1935 and its next election in 1945, because for those 10 years, the country was facing an existential crisis. It was facing war. And during war, a lot of things can go wrong. There are over 1 million Ukrainian soldiers, questions about how they are supposed to vote. Then you've got 4 million Ukrainians currently living under occupied territory in Russia. Then you've got 4.5 million Ukrainians abroad right now in Europe, and you've got 4 million Ukrainians displaced inside Ukraine. This would make voting incredibly difficult. And a lot of people have come out to this in the last few days and they've said, well, what if you could just digitalize the entire system? People could just download an app, right? Ukraine is already very technically advanced, but that would face another massive problem, and that is Russia's election meddling. And that isn't just something that happens here in Ukraine. Since 2016 and before, Russia has unleashed huge amount of resources in election meddling, disinformation with the United States election, with the British Brexit vote. We've seen endless evidence of this all across Europe. And there has been no greater threat to an election during wartime, probably in human history. And just think about it for a second. You're a soldier in position in Dobrobylia, you're a soldier in position in Kramatorsk, there's missiles landing every single day, the polling station's open. A, how are you supposed to get out of position to get to the polling stations? B, a polling station requires an address, and there are missiles and drones hitting Ukraine every single day that would most certainly hit those polling stations to interfere with the democratic process. Again, this is why not just Ukraine, but countless countries have postponed or cancelled elections during war. It's not because Ukraine woke up one day and decided that they were bored of elections, they didn't want to have democracy anymore. And there's another reason with all of this, and that's that Ukrainians don't want anyone else deciding what happens with their democracy. They don't want anyone telling them what to do, whether that's Russian, and honestly, whether that's anyone in the United States. And there's a lot of questions right now about Fedorov's relationship with Elon Musk, and this is a critical part to all of this. I asked him at the end of my interview what he was going to do next, and he told me he was going to the United States and hopefully to meet Musk. And there's a lot of people that have been asking questions about that, serious questions, about the fact that Musk has been one of the most prominent figures calling for elections in Ukraine. Musk, Peter Thiel, Donald Trump, and now the most high-profile person who has called for elections is now going to get on a plane this week to meet that very person. It makes a lot of Ukrainians extremely nervous about who is actually deciding when they vote. Is it Musk or is it Federov? But another reason you can feel the reaction to this straight away here in Kyiv is because honestly, it's quiet. Right now should be one of the biggest protests taking place. There was a huge corruption scandal, another one just a couple of days ago, and this was comically corrupt. People with suitcases carrying them out of cars, bags of money being found, and there were huge protests that were planned about this. The local police also said when Federov was first fired, up to 6,000 people took to the streets protesting that decision. And this one, when Parliament opened, was meant to be the biggest on record. And there was almost nothing. There were a handful of people taking to the streets the morning after. They disappeared after a couple of hours. And by that evening, there was almost no one there. And this evening, the city is almost completely silent. About 4 weeks ago, there was thousands of people here. I was up there on the top of that building looking down. And there's no one here. There's about 20 Ukrainians gathered in the fountain here right in the center. And I asked a few people what they were going to do next, and almost everyone said they were surprised, really surprised and shocked by the announcement for an election. A lot of people still disagreed with it, disagreed with the idea that Ukraine should have elections right now. Some did agree. Some were calling directly for Zelensky to still be impeached. They probably thought that originally anyway.
And today we just decided to gather to think what we will do next. Because honestly, we don't know. Some people wanna elections, some people don't want, okay? Some people want impeachments. It's very hard in a wartime to do some elections because it's not safe. We can lose our sovereignty, right? But from another side, we cannot keep up with the level of corruption now.
But again, it just shows the drastic and the stark difference between, honestly, just a couple of weeks ago, what was expected to happen and what the situation is here now. And again, that is because support for Federov is fractured right now. But again, don't just take my word for this. One of the organizers of the original protests for Federov has come out in the last 24 hours and said, you know what? Actually, we don't need elections in Ukraine. This is a wrong time to do this. This is an inappropriate time for elections. And I don't agree with Federov on this. And this is the person who was organizing those rallies from the beginning. And that shows just how seismic that shift is right now. So again, I don't think that Federov expected this to happen. I don't think he anticipated it. And maybe that is what's going on right now. Maybe Zelensky was surrounded by a bubble and he didn't expect a negative reaction from firing Federov. And maybe Federov had a bubble around him as well of yes men, of people telling him what he wants to hear. And he didn't expect people to be so disillusioned by his demands for an election. Maybe that's where this ends. But again, maybe it isn't. The questions about Musk, the questions about voting during wartime still stand at its core right now. Because what Federov said when he made that video was essentially it is Russia that are deciding Ukrainian democracy and Ukrainian elections right now. Because there are no elections here, that's because of Russia's invasion. But there's an inverse to that exact argument, and that is if there was a vote tomorrow, the millions of Ukrainians under occupied territory wouldn't be able to go to the ballot. And that is legitimizing Russia's war of aggression. It's legitimizing the front line as it stands right now, and it's legitimizing what Russia is doing. And honestly, that's why right now Ukraine has just collided with one of the biggest contradictions that a democracy can possibly face, and that is elections during wartime. But there's a bigger picture to all this right now, zooming back beyond this argument between Fedorov and Zelensky about corruption and about elections, and that is the state of Ukraine. Today there's been 7 air alerts. There's one right now as I'm talking. There's actually smoke billowing right behind me. And that's because air defense has been completely depleted here in Kyiv. I've never felt the city so on edge. And honestly, the way that locals have described it to me is a feeling of death raining down from the skies at any moment with no way to stop it. The city hasn't felt as vulnerable since the first days of the full-scale invasion before anything had arrived. And that has had a profound psychological impact all across this country. People are on edge, people are exhausted, and people are nervous. And they're nervous because they know for a fact that there's an overwhelming question that hangs over everybody right now. And that is still the question of the very survival and existence of this country, which is still in question. The front lines right now are still moving in this direction. 500 children were just evacuated from Kramatorsk last week, and the front lines moving closer to that city every single day. Putin is inching closer to stealing the Donbass and to stealing the fortress belt. And every single day, hundreds of Ukrainians are dying on the front lines. And there are major mobilizations and drafts every single day to try and counteract this. But it's still getting worse every single day. But honestly, there's a moment of hope in all of this, genuinely. And I know it's hard to believe that when the times feel as dark as now, when it feels like there's a second war that's opened up, a second war here in Kyiv to do with politics. And that's that there is still an answer to all of this. And I want to refer back to an interview that I did, not the one with Fedorov, and actually not the one with Zelensky, but the interview that I did with Robertson just a few weeks ago, because he basically holds the key to the end of this war. and that's Ukraine's long-range strikes. And Robert Rovdy is the person doing it. Right now, this week, one of Russia's most key state bankers was fired for saying that Russia was losing its edge economically to Ukraine, to China and America, that Russia was facing a catastrophe. Right now, there are still new queues all over Russia. There are still fuel shortages across gas stations. Russia has shut down most of its fuel exports because of the strikes. And as I'm speaking right now, there are probably logistics centers all across the country still on fire. And that is honestly where all the hope lands. So again, I wanted to bring this full circle. I wanted to give my opinion and my impression as someone that sat with Federov just a couple of days ago and can assess and look back on this whole situation, but also bring the bigger picture. How it feels here in Ukraine, a dark and difficult time. People here know winter is coming. They know that cities are more vulnerable than they've ever been, but they also know that there is a moment right now and a window where Ukraine could genuinely force Russia to stop. And that isn't by arguing here in Kyiv about politics, about who should be in charge, about how much influence Elon Musk has on the election, about whether elections should even happen, about how corruption should be stopped. It's about how quickly Russia can be economically destroyed so it can leave Ukraine in peace, and leave Ukraine to do whatever the hell they want at the ballot box. And that is the question that overarches all of this right now. And that could be the defining moment to this entire war. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this. I really appreciate your time. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment. Let me know what you thought about it, what you liked, what you didn't like about it. And if you want to see my next films, I'm currently editing my documentary about Donbass. I've just come back from Kramatorsk, and it shows how people are still surviving every single day with the Russians inching closer. So if you want to see that video, please hit subscribe, and I shall see you next time.